I had never imagined that a simple request could change everything in an instant. The day had begun like any other, but my heart was heavy with anticipation, worry, and the kind of aching hope I couldn't quite name. After months of separation and endless legal battles, I was finally granted permission to see my son, just for a few hours. My mind raced as I prepared, rehearsing every word, every gesture, every attempt to make the most of these fleeting moments. I arrived at the house quietly, careful not to draw attention, clutching a small bag of his favorite snacks and toys. The sight of him, innocent, smiling, oblivious to the storm of adult conflict swirling around him, hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, nothing else mattered: the arguments, the pain, the betrayal. There was only him, his laughter, and the fragile thread connecting us that I had spent so long trying to preserve. Minutes passed like hours as we played, laughed, and talked. I traced the curve of his cheek, memorized the way he twirled his hair, and soaked in the warmth of his presence as if trying to imprint it on my soul. I knew these moments were numbered, precious, and impossible to replace. And then, just as I was beginning to feel a fragile sense of peace, I noticed something, a small, subtle movement that made my stomach drop. I turned, and the world seemed to tilt. My ex-husband was standing in the hallway, and what I saw next is something I will never forget. His hands, once familiar, once reassuring, were engaged in something dark and incomprehensible. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, my mind refused to process what was happening, as if it couldn't reconcile the man I had once loved with the actions unfolding before my eyes. Fear and disbelief collided inside me. I wanted to scream, to intervene, to do anything to protect my son, but I was paralyzed. The seconds stretched into an eternity, and I realized that this was no accident, no ordinary lapse of judgment. Whatever he was doing, it was deliberate and horrifying. I clenched my fists, my entire body trembling, as I watched in shock, trying to comprehend the reality that had shattered the fragile hope I had carried into the house. Every instinct screamed that something irreversible had begun, that the safety of my child, and everything I had fought to preserve, was at stake. And in that moment, I understood. My final visit with my son had become a confrontation with a truth so dark, so unexpected, that nothing would ever be the same again. My heart raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to intervene, to pull my son out of harm's way, but the room seemed frozen in time, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The man I had once trusted, the man who had shared my life and the father of my child, was doing something that no words could prepare me for. I wanted to call out, to demand an explanation, but my voice was trapped in my throat. Fear, disbelief, and a rising tide of anger mixed into a sensation that was almost physical, pressing against my chest. Minutes, or maybe only seconds, passed, each one stretching longer than the last, and I realized that whatever had been done could not be undone. Then it happened. I saw the culmination of his actions, and the world seemed to tilt again. My son's laughter, moments ago pure and bright, was now tinged with confusion. He looked up at me with wide eyes, sensing the tension in the room, sensing the unspoken alarm radiating from my body. My stomach turned, my hands shook, and for the first time in months, I felt utterly powerless. What have you done?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice low but trembling. His expression froze, then twisted into something I barely recognized, a mixture of guilt, defiance, and cold calculation. There was no warmth there, no remorse, only a realization that I had discovered what he had tried to hide. My mind raced, recalling every argument, every moment of tension, every sign I had ignored, and I saw clearly for the first time just how far he was willing to go. I moved closer to my son, shielding him instinctively, my maternal instincts kicking in like a protective force I could not control. My eyes never left him, the man I had once loved now reduced to a figure I barely understood, someone capable of actions that threatened everything I held dear. "Mom?" My son's voice trembled, small and uncertain. My heart clenched. "Why is he?" I forced a calmness I didn't feel, kneeling to his level and taking his tiny hands in mine. "It's okay, sweetheart. Mommy's here. Everything's okay," I said, though my own mind was racing faster than ever. The truth of what I had just witnessed could not be undone, and yet I had to protect him, had to navigate the chaos that had been unleashed in a matter of minutes. The man, my ex, stepped back, realizing that his secret had been exposed. I could see the calculation in his eyes, how to regain control, how to mask the truth, how to manipulate the narrative in his favor. But I had seen it all. Nothing would be hidden again. And in that instant, I understood something crucial. The fight was no longer just about custody, visitation rights, or legal battles. It was about survival, about protecting my child from a danger I had never anticipated. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The world outside the walls of that house seemed distant and irrelevant. The only thing that mattered now was my son, the safety I had to ensure, and the dark truth that had been revealed in the span of minutes. And as I held him close, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against mine, I realized that this final visit, the one I had hoped would be bittersweet but peaceful, had become a confrontation with a reality I could never forget. Whatever had been done, whatever secrets had been hidden, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. I would protect my son at all costs, confront the darkness that had entered our lives, and face a truth so unimaginable that it would haunt me for years to come. The minutes that followed felt like hours, each second stretching painfully as I tried to collect myself. My son clung to me, small arms wrapped tightly around my neck, his warmth and innocence contrasting sharply with the chaos that had erupted in the room. I could feel his heart racing, mirroring my own, and I realized that my role had shifted instantly, from a mother cherishing fleeting time to a protector confronting a danger I hadn't anticipated. I finally managed to find my voice, trembling but firm. "You will not do this. Not now, not ever," I said, my eyes locking onto my ex-husband's. I could see the tension in his face, the subtle hesitation that betrayed his inner panic. He had been caught off guard, and in that moment, the power dynamic shifted. I wasn't just a visitor anymore, I was a force, a mother willing to confront the unimaginable to protect my child. He tried to speak, but the words faltered, his attempts at explanation or justification collapsing under the weight of what I had seen. I didn't need his reasons. I only needed action, proof that he would not harm my son, proof that he understood the severity of what had just transpired. But even as I demanded accountability, I sensed a deeper darkness, a recklessness I could not ignore. The room seemed to close in, suffocating with the intensity of the moment. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of paper, every movement was amplified in my awareness. My son's small voice trembled again. "Mommy, what's happening?" I swallowed hard, forcing calm into my words even as my mind raced with fear, anger, and disbelief. "Nothing's going to happen to you, sweetheart. Mommy's here. I'm not letting anything happen to you." I hugged him tighter, silently promising that I would protect him, no matter the cost. Then I noticed the small details I had initially missed, the subtle glances, the shifting of objects, the careful placement of something in the shadows. My heart sank. Whatever had happened minutes ago, whatever I had just witnessed, was only part of the story. There were layers I hadn't understood yet, hidden consequences I hadn't anticipated. The revelation was bigger than I had imagined, and it demanded immediate action. I stood up slowly, holding my son close. "We're leaving now," I said, my voice unwavering, though my body trembled with adrenaline. Every instinct screamed at me to get us out of the house immediately, to remove him from a place where danger had crept in unnoticed. And yet, as we moved toward the door, I realized that leaving was only the first step. The fight, the confrontation, the unraveling of this nightmare, it had only just begun. As I opened the door, I caught one last glance at him, my ex-husband. His eyes were no longer defiant, they were calculating, measuring, plotting. Whatever had been done minutes ago was deliberate, and now he had a choice: attempt to manipulate, to justify, or to escalate. And I knew that whatever he chose, I could not allow my son to be a pawn in his scheme. Once outside, the cool air hit my face, but it did little to calm the storm raging within me. I held my son tightly, feeling his heartbeat slow only slightly as we walked away from the house. The realization sank in fully: this final visit, which I had envisioned as bittersweet but tender, had become a turning point, a confrontation with a truth so dark that it would follow me long after the night ended. I knew I had to act, but the question remained: how? How could I protect my child from someone I had once loved, someone who knew every weakness, every vulnerability in our lives? How could I confront the aftermath of an act so sudden, so shocking, that it left no room for hesitation? And as I looked down at my son's trusting face, I understood the only certainty in this chaos: I would not let fear dictate my actions. I would fight, I would strategize, and I would protect him with everything I had. No secret, no act of betrayal, no darkness, no matter how unimaginable, would ever take him from me. That night, I realized something profound: motherhood is not measured in time, in legality, or in shared moments alone. It is measured in courage, in the willingness to face the unimaginable, and in the relentless protection of the heart that depends on you. And from this night forward, nothing would ever be the same. The hours after leaving that house felt surreal, as if the world outside had continued on its routine path while my life had fractured irreparably. I sat in my car, clutching the steering wheel, my son asleep in the back seat, and replayed every moment over and over in my mind. Every detail mattered: the way he had moved, the subtle gestures I had missed, the shadowed corners where his intentions had been hidden. I realized that the danger I had glimpsed was far deeper than a single act. It was a calculated web, a darkness I hadn't yet fully understood. I knew I couldn't wait. I couldn't rely on the legal system alone, couldn't trust anyone else to recognize the gravity of what I had seen. I needed evidence, I needed clarity, and most of all, I needed a plan. Every instinct screamed at me to act swiftly, to ensure my son's safety and to uncover the full scope of what had happened. I began retracing our steps in my mind, noting every object, every movement, every detail that could become proof of his intentions. The first step was confronting the truth in my own mind. I had to acknowledge that the man I had loved, the father of my child, was capable of actions I could never have anticipated. The betrayal was not just emotional, it was strategic, deliberate, and potentially dangerous. And understanding this was critical. If I denied it, I would endanger myself and my son further. If I faced it fully, I could start reclaiming control. I began collecting information, texts, emails, and messages I had overlooked during our separation. I spoke to neighbors cautiously, trying to gauge what they had seen, what they might know. Every conversation, every fragment of information added another piece to the puzzle, slowly revealing the extent of his manipulations. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. He had been orchestrating scenarios, controlling perceptions, and even manipulating our son's routines to maintain power. But I also realized something crucial: panic and anger were dangerous. I couldn't confront him recklessly, I had to be strategic. Every step had to be calculated, every action deliberate. My son's safety depended not only on my courage but on my ability to act with precision. I learned to channel fear into focus, to let adrenaline sharpen my perception rather than cloud my judgment. The next day, I returned to the house, but not to confront him directly. I observed from a distance, taking note of routines, habits, and interactions. I watched his movements, noting patterns, uncovering inconsistencies. I realized that the man I had once known was now almost unrecognizable. Beneath the familiar exterior was someone methodical, calculating, and willing to risk everything to maintain control. When I finally confronted him, it was with calm, deliberate words and a careful display of evidence I had collected. I could see the shock in his eyes as he realized that I was no longer vulnerable, no longer naive. He tried to mask it with anger, with defensiveness, with attempts at manipulation, but I saw through it. Every word he uttered, every gesture, betrayed a man cornered by the truth he had tried to hide. "I'm done pretending," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline beneath it. "You've crossed a line that cannot be undone. I will protect my son. I will make sure nothing you do can threaten him again. And I will prove every move you've made to the world if I have to." The tension was palpable. The air seemed to crackle with the weight of unspoken consequences. I realized then that this wasn't just about custody or visitation, it was a battle for our lives, for our safety, and for the very innocence of the child who depended on me completely. By the end of that confrontation, one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same. The man I had known was gone, replaced by someone unpredictable and dangerous. And I, too, had changed. The fear and despair that had once threatened to paralyze me had transformed into vigilance, strategy, and an unyielding determination to protect my son at any cost. As I drove away that night, my son asleep in my arms, I realized that survival in the face of betrayal requires more than courage, it requires clarity, planning, and relentless commitment. And though the journey ahead was uncertain, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I would face whatever came next, for him, and I would never let the darkness of that day define our lives. The following days were a blur of planning, observation, and quiet desperation. I knew that simply leaving the house and retreating into safety was not enough. He was unpredictable, cunning, and had already proven he was willing to cross any line. Every thought, every move, every word had to be calculated, not just for my own safety, but for the safety of my son, whose trust and innocence depended entirely on me. I began documenting everything meticulously. Every text message, every email, every interaction became evidence. I memorized routines, tracked subtle behaviors, and even noted how he interacted with neighbors and acquaintances. I realized that the truth alone was not enough. I had to anticipate his next move, understand his patterns, and prepare for anything. Every instinct I had as a mother, every lesson from my past, had to be sharpened into precision. Then came the moment I dreaded most: the confrontation. I arranged to meet him in a neutral location, carefully choosing a public space where he could not isolate my son or me. My heart pounded as we arrived, my son clutching my hand tightly, sensing the tension in the air. I could feel the weight of months of fear, anxiety, and uncertainty pressing down on me, yet beneath it was a new, unshakable determination. He arrived moments later, attempting a calm, controlled demeanor, but I could see through the facade. The same man who had orchestrated the chaos in my life now tried to mask fear with arrogance, but the cracks were undeniable. I took a deep breath and faced him directly, making eye contact, letting him know that I was no longer vulnerable, no longer uncertain, no longer afraid. "I know everything," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I've seen what you've done, the lines you've crossed, the risks you've taken, and I'm not letting it continue. My son's safety is non-negotiable. Do you understand?" For a moment, he didn't answer. The silence was deafening, filled with the unspoken tension of what had transpired and what could come next. Then, slowly, he nodded, but it wasn't a gesture of submission. It was a recognition that I had shifted the balance of power entirely. I reached out to hold my son's hand, grounding myself and him in the moment. "This ends now," I continued. "No more secrets, no more games. Everything you've done will be accounted for. I will protect him, and I will not allow anything to threaten him again." He swallowed hard, a flicker of emotion crossing his face, guilt, fear, or perhaps something deeper I couldn't yet name. But I didn't hesitate. I had prepared, documented, and planned every step, and I knew that hesitation could cost us everything. This confrontation was not just about words, it was about ensuring a future where my son was safe, where I had control, and where the darkness of the past could no longer dictate our lives. After that meeting, I realized something profound: survival, protection, and justice are rarely instantaneous. They require vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to face the unimaginable. I had been tested in ways I never imagined, forced to confront betrayal, fear, and the potential for harm to the person I loved most. And in that crucible, I discovered a strength I didn't know I possessed: the fierce, relentless power of a mother willing to do anything for her child. As we walked away, my son laughing quietly for the first time in what felt like days, I understood that this was not just a victory, it was a transformation. The world had shown me its darkness, but I had found the light within myself to face it. I had learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. That love is not measured by moments alone, but by the relentless protection of those who depend on you. And that sometimes, the most ordinary visits, minutes of togetherness, can become the most extraordinary tests of character, endurance, and devotion. That night, as my son slept peacefully in my arms, I allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. The danger had passed, at least for now, but the lessons of those hours, minutes, and seconds would remain with me forever. I had confronted a darkness no one else had imagined, faced a truth that threatened to shatter my world, and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. And as I held my child close, I knew that no matter what came next, I would face it, not as a victim, not as a bystander, but as a mother, unyielding, vigilant, and unbreakable. The days and weeks that followed were unlike anything I had ever experienced. The immediate danger had passed, but the weight of what had occurred lingered, pressing on my chest like a constant reminder that our lives had been irrevocably changed. I knew the confrontation had been only the first step. The real challenge, the long, grueling process of recovery, trust building, and vigilance, was just beginning. At home, I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every shadow. My son, though resilient and innocent, had sensed the tension, the fear, and the fragility of our lives in those critical moments. I spent hours reassuring him, rebuilding his sense of security, and trying to recreate a semblance of normalcy. It was exhausting, emotionally and mentally, but essential. I realized that protecting him wasn't just about shielding him from danger, it was about restoring his world, one piece at a time, so that the trauma wouldn't define him. I also had to navigate the legal system with relentless determination. Custody battles, restraining orders, and careful monitoring became daily necessities. Every step was calculated, every decision strategic. I worked with attorneys, child advocates, and trusted friends to ensure that no loophole, no oversight, could be exploited. The man who had once been my husband had demonstrated a capacity for manipulation I had never imagined, and I knew that vigilance was the only way to secure a future for my child. Yet amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. I began to understand the depth of my own resilience. The fear, anger, and despair that had initially threatened to consume me transformed into a quiet, unshakable strength. I realized that survival in the face of unimaginable betrayal required more than courage. It required clarity, foresight, and the ability to make difficult decisions without hesitation. I had been tested in the most intense way possible, and I had passed, not unscathed, but stronger and more capable than ever before. Over time, I also discovered that healing was not a linear process. There were moments of fear, flashes of doubt, and pangs of anger that resurfaced unexpectedly. But each time, I reminded myself and my son that we had already endured the worst and emerged on the other side. I taught him to be cautious but not fearful, aware but not paranoid, strong yet compassionate. I realized that my own growth as a mother, protector, and human being was inseparable from his well-being. In those long nights, when the house was silent and the world felt distant, I reflected on the incredible resilience of the human spirit. I had confronted a darkness no one had anticipated, faced a betrayal that threatened everything I loved, and emerged not broken but transformed. The mother who had walked into that house months ago, trembling and uncertain, was no longer the same. She was vigilant, decisive, and unyielding, a guardian of her child's innocence and future. Months turned into years, and the impact of that night became part of the foundation upon which I built our lives. We created routines, traditions, and bonds that were stronger than fear, anchored in love and trust. I never forgot the lessons I had learned, the importance of vigilance, the necessity of action, and the immeasurable power of a mother's courage. My son grew up knowing safety, love, and unwavering protection, but also awareness, the ability to perceive the world clearly, to recognize deception, and to act with integrity. And though the man who had once been my husband remained a presence in the background of our lives, he no longer held power over us. His actions had consequences, and I ensured they were felt, not through vengeance, but through accountability and vigilance. I had reclaimed control, rebuilt our world, and demonstrated to both him and myself that no threat could define us. Looking back, I realized that the true story of that day was not merely about danger or betrayal, it was about transformation. It was about the discovery of strength in the face of fear, clarity in the face of chaos, and love in the face of darkness. The final visit, which I had once feared would be ordinary, had become a crucible that forged me into the mother, protector, and strategist I was always capable of becoming. And in the quiet moments, when I held my son and watched him sleep peacefully, I understood the most profound truth: the world can challenge you in ways no one expects, darkness can appear where you least anticipate, and yet the courage to confront, protect, and endure can transform fear into unwavering strength. Our lives were forever changed, but in that change, we discovered resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child, stronger than any secret, any betrayal, and any darkness the world could throw our way. Years had passed since that day, yet its memory remained vivid, etched into my mind like a scar I both resented and revered. The final visit, the confrontation, the revelation of betrayal, it had become more than a memory. It had become a foundation, a crucible that shaped the way I viewed the world, my child, and myself. Every decision, every moment of parenting, every interaction with the outside world was informed by what we had endured. My son had grown, resilient yet perceptive, carrying with him the lessons I had instilled: vigilance without paranoia, courage without recklessness, and compassion tempered with awareness. He knew the world was not always safe, that even those closest could deceive, but he also knew that love and protection could overcome fear. Watching him navigate life with confidence, curiosity, and integrity was my greatest victory, the tangible proof that even the darkest experiences could forge strength rather than break it. I, too, had changed profoundly. I had become more than a mother, I had become a guardian, strategist, and observer of human nature. The fear that once paralyzed me had been replaced with clarity, the desperation replaced with decisiveness. I had learned to read motives, anticipate actions, and act with precision. But beyond strategy, I had learned humility, the deep understanding that even the strongest plans can falter, that human nature is unpredictable, and that protection is not passive. It is active, relentless, and evolving. The man who had once been my husband remained a distant figure in our lives, a shadow whose influence had been irrevocably diminished. Legal boundaries, accountability, and the undeniable vigilance I maintained ensured that his capacity to harm was neutralized. But more importantly, he no longer held the power to define our narrative. The story of fear and betrayal had become one of resilience, empowerment, and triumph. Yet the true transformation was subtler, more profound, and enduring. I had learned to cherish moments of innocence, to recognize the fragility of trust, and to value clarity over comfort. I had learned that danger often comes disguised in familiar forms, and that courage is not the absence of fear but the mastery of it. I had discovered a power deeper than authority, wealth, or control, the power of unwavering protection fueled by love, insight, and unrelenting commitment. As I watched my son play, laugh, and grow, I understood that our lives were no longer defined by that one terrifying day, but by the strength we had cultivated in its aftermath. The home we rebuilt, the routines we established, and the bond we forged were stronger than any fear, any deception, or any threat that might arise. We had transformed trauma into wisdom, betrayal into resilience, and fear into a legacy of empowerment. And in quiet moments, when the world seemed still, I often reflected on how a single visit, the one I had feared would be ordinary, had changed everything. It had tested me, broken illusions, and forced me to confront truths I never wanted to see. Yet through that trial, I had discovered a capacity for courage, strategy, and love that defined not only the mother I had become but the human being I was evolving into. The final lesson, the one that lingered most vividly, was simple yet profound. The bonds forged in adversity, the vigilance maintained through chaos, and the courage sustained in the face of unimaginable betrayal, these are what endure. They shape lives, define legacies, and leave imprints far beyond the moments of fear that once threatened to consume us. We had survived. We had endured. And in that survival, we had discovered something far more powerful than fear, betrayal, or danger, the unbreakable connection between a mother and her child, a bond resilient enough to withstand even the darkest storms. That bond, forged in love, courage, and vigilance, would guide us, protect us, and shape us for the rest of our lives. And as I held my son close, watching him drift into sleep, I realized that though the past had been terrifying, the future was ours, not defined by fear, but by the strength, wisdom, and unwavering love that had carried us through it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew one truth with absolute certainty: we were no longer merely survivors. We were unshakable, unbreakable, and enduring, a mother and child forged by the trials of the past, ready to face whatever the world might bring.